afternoon, everybody. Thank you for dialing into this webinar. We're going to get started now. I can see we've got almost 100 guests with us today. This is the second in our series of protection of children webinars hosted by Ofcom. Our focus today is on the Children's Risk Assessment Guidance and our guidance on content that's harmful to children. Those of you who joined our first webinar will have found out a bit more about the overview of our consultation, what it contains, how to respond, and we had a real focus on the child access assessment and some really useful conversation about age assurance measures in the context of the protection of children consultation. So today we're focused on the types of content that we are seeking to protect children from and how industry should be conducting its risk assessment for their service. I should say before we get started today, first of all, that the difference from last time we met is that this webinar falls in the official pre-election period leading up to the UK's next general election on the 4th of July. So we won't be taking any questions or discussion points that relate to any party political or politically sensitive matters. Ofcom is an independent statutory body, so we're not formally bound by the same pre-election rules as government departments, but we are a high-profile public organisation with legislation that is in the public eye, and we don't want to impact any of that discussion with our webinar today. So we will remain focused on the documents that we've published, and we'll be sort of screening out any questions that seek to draw us down a route towards that general election and the surrounding issues. We have guests today largely drawn from industry, organisations who are likely to be regulated by the Online Safety Act, but we do have guests as well from civil society. The purpose today is to try and help organisations who will need to comply with the new rules to understand what their duties may be under our proposals, and to help you fill in a consultation response before the 17th of July. Before I hand over to our speakers today, I'll just highlight that at the top of your Teams tab, you should have a Q&A bar. If you'd like to submit any questions today, please do submit those. If you'd like to uprate by means of a thumbs up question, please do, and we can see which are the most popular and make sure we try and prioritize those. You might need to refresh or return to the top of the page during the discussion, so please do submit those at any point. We'd also love your help after the webinar by filling in a quick survey form to make sure that these sessions are as informative and useful as possible. So please let us know what you think and any improvements that we can make. We'll be sharing the slides and the recording of the webinar by email after the session, and you'll be able to access all three of the webinars in this series once they've taken place as well. So I think that's enough preamble, and I will hand over to our director, Almudena, to introduce today's session. Oh, I almost covered the agenda slide. There we go. So I think I've covered that. We're starting with our approach, which Almudena is going to lead on. We're talking about our register of risks and content that's harmful to children with Jess, and then children's risk assessments with Sylvia. So I think I can hand over to Almudena, and we'll move to the next slide as well.
Thank you, Ali. And my name is Almudena Lara, and I'm the director responsible for the protection of children policy here at Ofcom. I already covered the general framing for this work in the first webinar, but and I encourage everybody to look at the link that my colleagues will put on the chat here and will share in the communication that will follow this webinar. But before we do that, I still want to make sure that I cover at a high level where the protection of children proposals that we'll be discussing today fits in the wider framework. Just to remind everybody, the protection of children proposals were published on the 8th of May, and a link will also be shared with all of you to the wider content that backs up our proposals. So if we can move to the next slide, please. Just to put the protection of children in the context of the wider Online Safety Act, which gives Ofcom the powers over the regulation and the implementation of the duties under the Act. Our overarching objective here is to help achieve a safer life online for people in the UK. And we have 4 clear planks to that work, which are around governance, design and operations, choice and trust. So governance will cover in our next webinar some of the key proposals that we are putting forward in relation to governance, but this is also a key element that will drive the assessment of risk and the understanding of risk and the ownership of that risk within companies that we believe will lead and drive the change and the improvements that we are seeking for all users, but also in particular for children. Safety by design follows as well as one of our key plans to ensure that services that have already assessed and understand the risk implement safety measures and design their services in a way that actually helps to mitigate those risks. Choice is there to ensure that users have ownership over their online experiences and they are allowed to take more control of what they see and how they interact with one another. And finally, trust, which is linked as well to transparency, to create a trustworthy environment as well, one that also applies to Ofcom and the way we regulate services. Together, these 4 elements will drive safer lives online for all users and in particular children in the UK. Can move to the next slide. So when it comes to the protection of children, what the Act requires from services is a 4-step, 4 actions they need to take. First is to assess whether children are likely to access the service. That was part of our first webinar. And again, for those that did not attend that webinar, I encourage you to look at what was discussed. Then this is about ensuring that those services that are user-to-user services or shared services in scope of the Act look at the extent to which children are likely to be in those services. If the answer to that is yes, then they have obligations to complete a children's risk assessment to identify what are the risks to children. And that is the middle box there, which is what my colleagues Jess and Sylvia will be discussing today in more detail. The next step is implementing safety measures from our codes to mitigate those risks, and that will be the subject of our next webinar, which will take place on Wednesday. And finally, the 4th aspect of this work, which actually keeps it all up to date and ensures that services really keep understanding and keep their risk assessment and the safety measures under review to ensure that whenever there are changes that will affect the safety of their services and will impact on children, they understand that and they take the relevant measures to address that. If we move to the next slide, please. This is an overview of the consultation. For those of you that are not familiar with it, is divided in 5 volumes. Volume 1 is the overview, the scope, and the regulatory approach. Volume 2 is there to help services identify if children are likely to access the service. That's the Children's Access Assessment Guidance, which we cover in the first webinar. Volume 3, the causes and impacts of harm to children, covers all the compendium of our evidence on the risks of harm to children and how we are interpreting that in terms of the type of content that is likely to be harmful to children and the content that is not likely to be harmful to children according to the definitions in the Act. My colleague Jess will be covering all that content today. And volume 4 is the guidance to help services assess the risk that they pose to children. And that's, again, like what my colleague Sylvia will be covering. So today we're very much focusing on volume 3 and volume 4 of our consultation. Volume 5 is our Children's Safety Codes, which covers the measures that we are proposing that services should put in place to address those risks. And as I said before, that will be the subject of our webinar on Wednesday, and I encourage you all to attend. And with that, I'm going to pass on the baton to Jess. Thank you.
Thank you, Almudena. And hi, everybody. It's great to be with you today. My name's Jess Smith. I have led our work for this consultation on the Register of Risks and the guidance on content that's harmful to children. So if we just move on to the next slide, please. The Act defines content harmful to children on the face of the legislation. So there are several categories of harmful content. There's primary priority content, and then non-designated content. The primary priority content and priority content are distinct because the duties that relate to them are slightly different. So primary priority content, children must be prevented from encountering, and priority content, the duty is that children in age groups judged to be at risk of harm from priority content must be protected from it. So priority content is suicide, self-harm, and eating disorder content, and pornographic content. And just to unpack that sort of first bullet a little bit, suicide, self-harm, eating disorder content, it's content that promotes, encourages, or provides instructions for those behaviours. Priority content is, as is kind of set out in the bullets here, content that promotes abuse and hate, bullying, violent content, content that promotes the ingestion, inhalation, or otherwise taking of harmful substances, or content that promotes dangerous stunts and challenges. Now, the challenge with content that's harmful to children here is that there's obviously overlaps with illegal content. You'll notice some of the similarities with priority illegal content as set out in the first consultation that Ofcom did on illegal content. So what we have sought to do through our harms guidance is to provide more detail on the types of content that we are talking about here. Now, just to sort of be extremely clear, children also need to be protected from illegal suicide content and illegal self-harm content. But we think that there's a broader swathe of content there that might not meet the threshold of illegality, but which is still inappropriate for children to encounter. And so where we have focused our guidance is on that delta effectively between content that is illegal and content that is not necessarily illegal, but is harmful to children. And in our guidance, we set out what the relevant illegal content is that services also might want to familiarise themselves with and remind themselves of as they are doing their risk assessment on content harmful to children. And then just to pause on this green box here about non-designated content. So this was a further category of content that was introduced into the legislation. And it is content that is not primary priority content or priority content, but which presents a material risk of significant harm to an appreciable number of children. Now, the way that we have interpreted this category of content is to set out some criteria for assessing whether or not content presents a material risk of harm to an appreciable number of children. And we believe that there are some categories of content that are not currently covered by the other two categories that meet those criteria. And those are body image content. So this is content that promotes certain unhealthy body types, or is particularly denigrating of other body types, and depressive content. So this is content that's not necessarily explicitly related to suicidal ideation or self-harm, but that is normalizing or promoting of a poor state of mental health effectively. And so we proposed that these two categories of content should be considered non-designated content by all services. And throughout the consultation period, we will seek further evidence and seek to further refine our definitions of those types of content so that it's more straightforward for services to assess them. And that's work that we are undertaking now. So if we just move on to the next slide, please. So it says Ofcom's setting up the different categories of Ofcom's Children's Register of Risk. Now, the Register of Risk is similar to the approach that we took in our illegal harms consultation. Ofcom's Register of Risk is effectively our risk assessment for the whole sector, all of the services in scope of the legislation. And so it's basically what we sort of see the landscape of risk to look like. And it is also designed to be a reference source for services as they undertake their risk assessment. And so this slide sets out the different chapters that are within our Register of Risk. So you will see that we focus on the kinds of harmful content to children, and then also that we consider several cross-harm considerations, which I'll come to in a moment. But just to say that our Register of Risk draws on over 500 individual sources of evidence. In the course of that work and collating that evidence, it draws on evidence from over 15,000 children and 7,000 adults who care for children, including parents, teachers, and social workers. So it really accentuates the real experiences that children are having as they live their lives online and engage with these online services. And a lot of the evidence kind of comes directly from children, and that's fed through to the measures that we have set out in our codes and that you'll be hearing more about on Wednesday. But just to give you a specific example of that, we heard a lot from children encountering violent content online, to such an extent that one child described encountering violent content as an unavoidable part of being online. And one of the things that children told us was that they didn't want to pause on content or downrank content or report content because they felt that hovering over a content, even for a small period of time, would send the wrong signal to the algorithm, even if they were giving it a negative signal. So it's just a small illustration of how children are very informed users of these services. They know how they kind of adapt their behaviors in order to make the service work in better for them, but in a, with a slightly kind of perverse outcome there, obviously, in that they don't feel that they can report or downrank harmful content. So I just wanted to highlight that particular example there. Then we have a chapter on each of the categories of harmful content, and then we have our cross-harm considerations. And I'm just going to take these in turn because it's worth unpacking them a bit. So we talk about search and how harmful content manifests on search services. We find that search is a key vector of harm for children who are sort of actively seeking harmful content. We find that there are certain features that accentuate those risks, and we talk about those through those chapters. We focus on the governance systems and processes in place in services, and we find that where there is not effective risk management and where there's not effective systems and processes to manage harmful content, as you would expect, the risks of harm are exacerbated. We talk about the business models and the commercial profiles of services and how these interact with the risks of harm. And this is this is an important there's quite a lot of overlap here between how services are organised and the incentives that they manage, and how that feeds through to the experiences of the children on those services. So one of the issues that we talk about in this chapter is advertising-based revenue models, and how that requires a need to drive engagement of all users, including children, and how that can then feed through to harmful content. And one of the things that we talk particularly about throughout the risk register, but including in this chapter, is the recommender system, and how recommender systems on services can drive more extreme content, including harmful content, and how that particularly happens for children. So one of the things that we find is that children are more likely than most adults to encounter suicide, self-harm and eating disorder content, which is quite a shocking statistic, really. But actually that children with experience of mental health conditions or eating disorders are more likely, again, to encounter this kind of harmful content. We then look at features and functionalities affecting the frequency of use of these services. So this is particular, it's again about features that drive engagement, but it's about also features that notify children to look at these apps repeatedly, that notify them continuously, and that ultimately drive children to spend more time online. Now, this has been a key factor of, it was a big feature of parliamentary debate as the Act went through, and I know that it's something that civil society stakeholders are particularly concerned about. Now, we think that these features and functionalities do drive risk to children. I mean, it is simple maths that the more time that you spend online, the more likely you are to encounter kind of harmful content, but also that as children engage with certain things, then the risk to harm grows as kind of more extreme content is then provided to them. We talk about some wider context around understanding risk factors, including the context of children themselves and the risk profiles of different children themselves. I mentioned that children with experience of mental health conditions were more likely to encounter harmful content, and so we talk about how services can assess this. And then finally we talk about age groupings. Now, age groupings is an important factor in the because it links to the duty for protecting children from priority content under the Act. Now, we set out a proposal for the different age brackets that we think services should assess. I mean, it's obviously common sense that thinking about the risks to a 0 to 5-year-old is not the same as thinking about the risks to an older teenager, for example. They obviously use the online services in very, very different ways, and the risks to them are not the same. However, and I'll come on to this a little bit more when I talk about our harms guidance, but the types of content that we are talking about are very harmful for all children. While there may be kind of marginal cases where it would be appropriate for a teenager to be able to, an older teenager to be able to access certain types of information around, I don't know, news reporting on conflict zones, for example, we still think that it is there isn't an age group, there isn't any category of content which doesn't have risks to certain age groups of children. So while we do think that those risks need to be assessed differently in order to take account of the different developmental stages of children, we don't say that any type of content is okay for any types of older children, and it should still be harder for them to encounter it, even if it may be appropriate in some limited circumstances for older teenagers to access this kind of information. If I can move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So just to give you an overview of how we have approached our guidance on content harmful to children, this provides illustrative examples of the kinds of content that we consider to be primary priority content or priority content. It's not exhaustive. By definition, it is illustrative, but we have tried to make it as comprehensive as we could in order to give services sufficient guidance on what we expect to fall within the definitions of primary priority content or priority content. And I just wanted to pick up a couple of points on the harms guidance, because this is quite materially different to the way that we approached, for example, Ofcom's illegal content judgments guidance, which was about supporting services to make judgments about what kind of content was illegal. In this case, we don't have to rely on the definitions of the criminal that are set out in the criminal law. And a really important point to make here is that the intent of the poster of the content is not relevant for the purposes of assessing whether or not content is harmful to children. And just to give you an example, there is a fairly high risk category of content from the sort of that falls broadly within the bracket of suicide content or self-harm content or content related to mental health conditions, where it's kind of loosely termed recovery content. Now, there might be and is indeed many benign types of recovery content which are not harmful to children, but this is a high risk space. And quite often when people post about their personal experiences, for example, of eating disorders or of suicidal ideation, they may include details that could amount to instructions that children could follow. And we talk about recovery content where relevant in the sections that overlap, that just to sort of make it clear that it doesn't matter if the content is posted in a recovery context or if the intent of the poster is to share more about their experiences. It is about the features of the content itself. And while that poster may have every right to express their experiences, that does not then follow that that content is appropriate or should be shown to children. And so that's a distinction that we draw very clearly within the guidance, and that we think is really important. The other example that I wanted to draw out here was around abusive and hateful content and how we have interpreted that, where it might be slightly different to the approach that we've taken on the illegal side. One example, we're all aware of misogynistic influences, for example, and we have decided through our evidence gathering that content that promotes abusive or hateful or otherwise negative stereotypes about groups of people and associates those views with an affluent lifestyle, for example, is also content that's not appropriate for children, and therefore should be considered in the round as priority content. So I just wanted to give you a flavour there of the level of detail that we are seeking to get into in the harms guidance. We think that that goes much further, I think, than most services' public terms of service at the moment. And we really welcome any feedback or views on how we've interpreted those categories, and also also how they align with services kind of current practice right now. And I think I'm going to stop there and hand over to Sylvia.
Thank you very much. If we could go on to the next slide, please. So services likely to be accessed by children will need to carry out a suitable and sufficient children's risk assessment. There is quite a lot of detail here. I'll try to be brief, but I would recommend looking either at this slide or the relevant sections in the Act. The purpose of doing a risk assessment is identify the risk of harm to children on a service and put in place control measures to protect them. As you can see here, the Act is very specific about which risks to assess. So services have an obligation to assess the risk of children encountering those different types of content harmful to children, considering age groups risks. They need to consult Ofcom's risk profiles, which I'll touch on later. They need to assess risk levels for different kinds of content, considering age groups. Consider the design and use of the service, including features and functionalities. They need to assess the nature and severity of each of those relevant harms, considering age groups, and also assess how the design and operation of the service can reduce or increase risks. So just a few general things to keep in mind when doing a children's risk assessment. We've issued draft guidance, and following it is not mandatory. Services may have their own risk management practices, 3 or 5 steps. It may be different, and that's okay. What's really important that if they don't follow our suggested 4 steps in guidance, they need to ensure that they address the risks specific to the service, that they identify them and address them, and that they put in place appropriate safety measures. And of course, they need to keep a record of risk assessments supported by evidence, and the guidance has more detail around what is relevant evidence there. If we could pass on to the next slide, please. As for the children's risk assessment guidance itself, it follows, as I say, the same 4-step process as our legal guidance, but it does change its presentation. And we've done this in part to make the information more accessible and practical. And it also includes a comparison of the legal harms and children's risk assessment duties, which have a lot of similarities, but actually are different. On the more substantive issues, the duties are different, in particular, in considering different age groups, features and functionalities, and relevance to children, how children can be affected by cumulative harm, as my colleague Jess alluded to earlier, and whether they identify non-designated content, which they need to report to Ofcom. Could pass on to the next slide, please. So these are the 4 steps. You can find the Children's Risk Assessment Guidance in Annex A6 and its explanation in Volume 4. And it follows the same 4 steps. I'm not going to go too much into it except to outline them. And maybe we can just break it down a little in the next slide. So each step tries to plot the different duties into a risk assessment and management process. So first, to understand the harms, services must consult our risk profiles, as I mentioned, and identify the kinds of content harmful to children to assess. Second, services must assess the design and use and the risks relating to content harmful to children. They should be doing this through an evaluation of the likelihood and impact of harm. Then third, they must determine what controls are relevant and implement them. And finally, services should keep oversight of their risk assessments through appropriate corporate governance. They should monitor the effectiveness of mitigations that they have in place, and also review their risk assessment, which we recommend to do annually, similar to illegal harms guidance. If we could pass on to the final slide. So to just touch on risk profiles, they're based on the analysis that my colleague Jess covered in the Register of Risks. I won't go into any of the specific examples. I think there are quite a few illustrations there, but essentially risk profiles help services identify specific risk factors they need to take account of in their risk assessment. And I said earlier, services need to consider risk profiles. That is part of a duty they have. And risk profiles are tools that we published in our legal harms consultation, but they're of course different. I just want to highlight 3 key differences. One is, of course, user age risk factors, and Jess covered some of the child developmental issues that have been considered. The role of features and functionalities that can increase child engagement. And there's also information to help services consider cumulative harm relevant to children. There's some examples there of the risk factors, but I think we've covered quite a few in detail in the previous section. So just to summarize, we've issued the Children's Risk Assessment Guidance to help services meet their duties, to assess the risks and ensure that they mitigate them adequately. And you can find our guidance in the annex, and we'd really welcome your views on that. And I think I'm handing over to my colleague.
Hi, thanks. I'm just going to go through a couple of slides on how to engage with the consultation. Next slide. Yeah, so just in terms of navigating the documents themselves, it is important that our consultation document is thorough and it does contain all the details in our proposals, and that's why it is quite a lengthy document. But we have taken into consideration that our proposals must be accessible to the full range of stakeholders. So in light of that, we have produced some summary materials to help stakeholders navigate the documents. We've published a 25-page summary of the consultation and an at-a-glance document, which gives a summary of our proposed codes of measures and who they apply to. We also have got some quick guides on risk assessments and codes on our website. But for detail, we recommend that you do look at the full consultation document. There's 5 volumes and annexes as well. We produced some short accessible guides for the wider online safety regulations, and if you would like to help participate in shaping our resources, please do let us know. And also, if you'd like to sign up for some updates on the regulations, you can let us know as well. We will be sending all this information in a follow-up email. Our consultation closes on the 17th of July, and we'll have a further webinar on Thursday from 2 to 3.